Week we're talking about professional style in email. We're continuing our conversation from last week. Hopefully, you got my email about emails and had a chance to read that. So, let's go ahead and start the lecture. Okay, so I would like for you to look at this clip. I'm not going to click on it just because whenever I make a video in the PowerPoint, it takes me for copyright. So I'm just going to put the link up on our course webpage and you can watch it outside of this video, because that's what happened with last week's PowerPoint, is that I tried to have the video inside the clip, so it was all one whole clip, and they got me on copyright and I had to split it into two clips. So I apologize for that. I'll know now, though, not to do that. So it's that clip right there. So I'll just post the clip on our course webpage. But just to set this clip up, it's what email would be like if it existed in real life. So everyone's kind of going around acting as though they're in an email. All right, so I want you to kind of think about now what makes for an effective versus an ineffective email. Think about the emails that you've received from professors, from friends, family members. What characteristics did they have? I remember whenever my mom first learned how to or thought she learned how to use email, she wrote the entire email in the subject of the email. So the whole, "Hi Liz, how are you?" Wrote the whole thing in the subject heading. Obviously, she didn't get that she was supposed to move it down. So think about kind of the stories that you have and times where maybe even you made email mistakes. I know there's been situations where I sent an email out before and it did not have a subject headline, or I forgot to hit spell check, or the worst is when you send an email and you forget to put the attachment. Of course, now they've got that thing where I see you're trying to send an attachment. Did you forget? Please draft a list of suggestions for creating an effective email for a professional in your field. So I think that sometimes we have things that are specific to our discipline. So maybe think about that. So if we were in class together, I'd kind of pair you up in groups and ask you to think about those two questions. So think about that before we dive into the actual material. All right, so here's some things we're going to talk about today. What you should do before you send an email. We're going to talk about the you viewpoint and goodwill, a really kind of important concept within professional communication. The difference between a direct versus an indirect message. How to write and design an email. We're going to talk about some email tips and how to manage your email. I'm interested to see if you guys have a system for managing your email or what your inbox looks like. Is it very well organized with folders, or is it a hot mess? We're going to talk about some email mistakes to avoid, email etiquette, and tips for not being that guy, as well as what coworkers are expecting from you in terms of email. So, professional style and tone. A couple things to do before sending. Definitely revise. I would think about emails. Yes, I understand an email is a quick form of communication, but that doesn't mean that we still shouldn't be looking over it a few times, maybe even going to grab a cup of coffee, looking at it with a fresh set of eyes, and editing it. Making sure that our copy is still brief, is still tight. Emails are meant to be very, very short. If you have an email that is lengthy, that is not the point of an email. Generally, how emails were meant to be written is about one thing. So when you think about the subject heading and you've got 3 different things going on, there's a lot of people that say that should be 3 different emails. There's different schools of thought on that. But ideally, you want your emails to be very short and to the point. There are times when an email is not appropriate, and I really want you to think about your message and whether or not an email is an appropriate form of sending that message. I think a lot of times, especially in business, people send messages that are not needed. They waste time, they waste money, they take up people's inboxes, take up people's time. Maybe this should be a call. Maybe this should be a text. Maybe this doesn't need to be anything and you need to figure it out on your own. So really consider before you send that email. I think that if we send an email without checking, it makes people think less of us, less of the organization that we represent. I had a colleague of mine send me an email recently about asking for donations. It had a boatload of spelling errors in it. It takes a couple seconds just to, run the spell check. I'm sure I've made spelling mistakes before. We've all made mistakes, but just put ourselves in situations where we don't have to make as many mistakes. Definitely run a spell check. Anticipate the audience's reaction. Go that extra mile and think about, well, if I was this person, what would I think if I was receiving this? And this is just an example. Have you ever sent an email and it didn't have any kind of message to the person that you sent, just an attachment? No judgment here, but what kind of message do you think that could send? Especially to somebody who focuses a lot on relationship. They may think that that's not very warm or not very friendly. So I encourage you, whenever you do send people a message, to have a greeting. Hi, please see attachment, I hope you're well. Being kind, being warm, being professional, never going to hurt you. Being short, being curt, being lacking professionalism will hurt you. So anticipate your audience's reaction and always err on the side of being courteous, kind, and professional. Formal and informal style depends on the reader, purpose, and the context. So as a writer, we always come back to, what do I want to accomplish? What is the point? What am I trying to do? What's going on in the world right now? What are people kind of worried about or thinking about? And who's my reader? What do they care about? How can I make them care? Is this business or is this a friend? All right, so the tone. This is hugely important. One of the most important concepts that I think we talk about in this class is goodwill and the you viewpoint. And this, I think, will help you in life. If you approach every communication message thinking about how your audience will evaluate it, you're golden. If you approach your client and you try to think about, okay, how are they thinking about this message? How are they interpreting it? How are they funneling it through their understanding? You're going to be effective. So whenever you talk to a child, and that child is 5, okay, how does this 5-year-old understand something? Whenever you're talking to your instructor, okay, what is my instructor thinking about? So be respectful, not demanding. Be modest, not arrogant. Be polite, not sarcastic. Be positive, not tactful. Not negative or condescending. And so goodwill means you're always thinking about the person you're talking to. We're not thinking about ourselves. So if you're writing a memo about dress code, you obviously know that the person that you're writing the dress code policy to wants to wear what they want to wear. They don't want to be told what to do. Very few people do. If you're writing a memo about taking days off, and you want that memo to be as clear as possible. So just think about the person that you're writing to, and that will help you understand the you viewpoint. If you get wrapped up in you and what you want, that's not going to work. Always be thinking about the other person. That's why whenever companies focus on themselves, it doesn't go over well. All right, direct. Get to the point early. So this is the difference between direct versus indirect. Actually, just as a segue to this, let's go back for just a second. As a segue to this tone piece, Coke right now is in a little bit of hot water because they are doing this where they're focusing on themselves rather than on the you viewpoint. They just recently had a commercial where they featured their product, but they juxtaposed it next to Saudi Arabia because they recently had a change in their culture where women are allowed to drive. But what they did was they put it back on Coke. And so they were saying it was a lot like Kendall's Pepsi ad and saying, oh, this is all wrong. you're making this message about you're not making it about the customer, you're not making it about the world. So that's kind of a good example of not having the you viewpoint, of making it about us and not about the client, not about the consumer, and just an inappropriate message. So there's a lot of people that said, oh, Coke is saying this is a wonderful thing, and they're talking about the progress of women being able to drive, and they're like, no, actually, you just took an opportunity to talk about your product, and it's vastly inappropriate. So that's kind of an example of the not really using the you viewpoint. All right, now back to this idea of direct versus indirect. When you have an email, get to the point early. It's meant to be brief. This is typically appropriate for good news. That's why when you get a job, congratulations! It's the very first thing that you hear. Or the college acceptance letter. Congratulations, you're in. It should come right away. You shouldn't be 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 lines in and still don't know whether you got into Pitt. Typically, it's an outline pattern. You want to get to the main point of the message quickly and explain facts and details and have a goodwill closing. Again, a message of connection, that we have the reader's best interest at heart. That's what goodwill means. This is different from indirect, which is typically more appropriate for negative news or sensitive messages. Typically, whenever we're reading a message, we tend to form our impressions pretty early. So this is an example of an ineffective message. Dear Mr. Smith, your application has been rejected. There were candidates with more education and experience. Sincerely, supervisor. Now, yes, this gets to the point. It's certainly direct, but it's curt, it's unkind. I've had a lot of students before that tell me, I don't need you to warm me up. I just want you to get right to the point. But this is too much. There needs to be some kind of buffer. So what we want when we have bad news is a context, is a buffer. And so typically the organization of this type of message in an indirect pattern is some kind of buffer, an explanation about why we have the bad news, the actual bad news, and then some kind of point of goodwill or closing, saying that we still care and have concern about the reader. So here's an example of an effective indirect message. Thank you for your time and effort in applying for the admin role. Because we need someone who can assume duties with minimal training, we have selected an applicant with several years of experience. Your skill set and education are excellent, and I encourage you to apply for another position with us in the future. Now, I've had students before that have said, yeah, whatever, you're wasting my time. I don't need you to tell me that my education is excellent. I don't need you to tell me thanks for your time and effort. But it's just being polite. I think that you don't want to be too short, too curt. There's an aspect of being professional and kind when providing bad news, and that kind of short communication can really be off-putting. And there's a way of delivering bad news, especially with clients. Even if you're saying, all right, for me as an individual, I just want you to give it to me. But when you're working with clients and you're giving them bad news, there's a certain way to deliver that message. So we'll talk more about indirect and direct later. So writing and designing an email, let's get back to just emails in general. You want to make your point early. You want to have short paragraphs. Detailed messages should generally include a paragraph overview. I'm hoping, though, that if you have to have a really detailed message for an email, I'm thinking then maybe it should probably be another form of communication. I would err on the side of not having lengthy emails. Empty subject lines are unprofessional and could definitely be interpreted as spam, but I think we've all probably done it before. Check before you send. Standard greeting and closing. Adapt when it's more personal. Of course, if it's a friend or family member, it is possible, and I think it's sometimes nice to have a standard setup where you've got your name, your first name, your last name, your contact information, so that every time you send out an email, you have a signature, and you don't have to worry about it. It's a feature in Outlook and most other email programs. I would encourage you to use that. I have mine set up just because I think we all send a fair amount of emails. I think it's a good practice to have. Be mindful of cultural implications. I have I think 30% of my student population at RMU is from Saudi Arabia. I haven't noticed anything too different about that, but I do try, just because I know that English is not their first language, I tried not to use colloquialisms or things that I think are specific, to US or Western culture. I tend to be pretty direct, and I use very kind of specific terms. I don't, use too many media references because I want to make sure that I'm clear. So I would encourage you to do the same thing. Try to be very kind of direct. Be wary of personal sayings and a professional signature. I have one. I think that it's kind of up to the individual. We're going to look at some examples of ones that I would say you definitely don't want to have. I could see arguments for them depending on the field that you're in. That's kind of like one of these ones where it's like, well, maybe it's okay, maybe it's not. We'll talk more about it once we do the activity with emails. All right, email tips. Don't overuse email. If I could underline this and bold this and put an exclamation point, I would. This is big. I hope you get this tip. I think email is overused. I think that it's gotten out of control. I think that people email far too much. Pick up the phone. Reach out. Talk to somebody. Hear their voice. Communicate. Connect. Don't rely on email. It's not always effective. Just because it is a form of communication, it does not mean it is the only way to communicate. Think about, is it the best way to communicate? Going back to the very beginning of the class when we started talking about just communication in general and all the different ways that, what does the phone provide? Well, what does email provide? Well, what does, text messaging provide? Really think about it in that way. What does my audience need from me? What do I need from my audience? Not all email requires a response. This one's hard. I think that sometimes people are like, well, do I say thank you back? Do I just let sleeping dogs lie? I want to be polite. I want to let them know I got it. But then you're also kind of crowding up their inbox. So this would be a time in class where we would have a conversation about what are your email tips or email etiquette, which we're going to talk about in just a second. Consider filing emails and keeping them in your inbox organized. I would highly encourage you to have an email filing system to keep your inbox pretty well organized. Don't let it get out of control. 2 is the intended audience. Obviously, others are placed with CC or carbon copy. Ethically use the BC or what's called blind copy. In case you don't know what that means, I think you know the 2. The carbon copy you may not be familiar with. That's just so that other people could get a look at the email. The blind copy, though, you may not be familiar with either. That's whenever you're sending an email. Like, say, for example, I wanted to send an email to Remy, who is somebody in our class, and I also wanted to send a copy to Helen, somebody else in our class. But say that I blind copied Helen, which means that Remy wouldn't know. So the blind copy, like Helen would see it, but Remy wouldn't see it. So the blind copy, the person that you're sending it to, blind copy sees it, but the other person that gets the email doesn't know that you sent it to that person. So ethically use that because it could come back and bite you in the butt. And the carbon copy, when you send a carbon copy, like if I send an email to Helen and I send an email to Remy and I did carbon copy, they would know with a carbon copy that it was sent. Hopefully that's clear. If it's not, let me know and I can clarify a little bit more. Okay, managing your email. Read for clarity. I definitely read it out loud sometimes, especially if something's kind of difficult to understand or confusing. Don't be ambiguous in your emails. Be real direct, real clear. This is not a time to be cutesy or sarcastic. A lot of things can get lost in translation. I would say, especially in a professional setting, avoid jokes and spam and office gossip and what they call flaming. That is a communication term which is the equivalent of online bullying. Just don't do it. Again, a lot of things lost in translation. Err on the side of just being careful. Usernames and your address should always be professional and appropriate. Format. Obviously, sign your emails. I would encourage you when you send emails to have a greeting, to have a closing. I think that, especially for people that are more sensitive, and we will work with people that are sensitive, they can make some assumptions about being unkind or not friendly if you just send an attachment with no, hello or goodbye. My father writes in all caps. Do not do this in an email. People will assume that you are yelling. Lowercase is not very professional either. This next one I would use as a point of conversation if we were in class together. Courtesy responses. I've had some students that say, don't do that. I don't like that. I feel put off if you tell me, hey, I got your email, I just need a little bit more time. Don't respond to me until you're ready to respond to me. And then I've had other students who are like, oh, I'm so glad. I was worried you didn't get my email. So that's one of those things where you have to kind of think about who you're talking to and what they would want you to do, where that's where knowing who you're talking to really matters. I would keep my personal life personal, and I would keep my work life professional. So I would encourage you to have a personal email address, and I would encourage you to not send personal messages from your work email. I think that we have enough examples from the political world or otherwise that show us that we should be keeping those two worlds separate. All right, here's some things to avoid in terms of mistakes. Make sure your subject line is really specific, well thought out, short. Don't use jargon. You want to make sure that you have a personal greeting, that you're, saying hello to the person, friendly. Don't talk about too much in one email. It's really overwhelming to the person who's reading it. Try to just keep it to one subject per email. I have had other students that say, though, don't spam me. Don't send me like 3 different emails. Just send me one email and talk about it all in that. So again, that's a hard one. That is a hard one to figure out. Avoid abstract language. We haven't really talked very much about language yet. The idea of abstract versus concrete language. Concrete is more, she weighs 225 pounds versus abstract saying she's larger. Avoid the abstract. Use the concrete. Saying she lives really, really far away would be abstract versus saying she lives 200 miles away would be concrete. So you want to use more concrete language. Copy and paste and using attachments. Be wary with that. If you do attach, of course, be sure to actually attach it. Explain the attachments. Let them know what they're looking at, why it's important. Set it up. And then if you are going to include your signature, you want them to be able to find you in multiple ways. So your first name, last name, LinkedIn if you have it, your phone number, if you have a website that you want them to look at, a professional URL. Those are some things that I would typically include in a signature. Definitely proofread your work, and you want to have some kind of formatting. It should appear still visually. It should appear, stimulating. Okay. Email etiquette. This says reply no matter what. This is suggested by Johnson. If you're interested in any of these kind of tips, the articles are at the very end in my source citation. So if you're interested in email or learning more about email, these are all articles that I kind of pulled from more recent articles. This particular author says reply no matter what. I don't really know that I agree with that. I think sometimes if you always reply, you're just going to have an email chain that goes on forever. So I would probably not agree with the author. I would say reply if it's appropriate rather than reply no matter what. If you're a carbon copy, don't reply. I would say that's pretty true. Definitely watch your tone. I would err on the side of being friendly and being more detailed and direct. I think, again, you don't want to offend. I wouldn't use emoticons typically in a professional message. What you do with your friends is your own business. I would update the subject line, especially if the email changes. Don't forget your attachments. Answer all their questions. I know for my students, this is a huge pet peeve of theirs where they, will often email their professors. They have 4 questions. 2 of them are answered. That's very, very frustrating for them. Know the cultural expectations of the company and field as well as just the expectations of not just the culture, but like the organizational culture of what's appropriate for where you work. If it is okay to send after work we're all going to go over and grab some wings and mozzarella sticks or whatever, that's fine. But if that's not okay, then do not do that. If it's okay to send a funny joke, all right, that's fine. If it's not, do not do that. You don't want to be the person in the office that's like, oh, she sent that kitty picture with a rainbow again. What's wrong with her? Follow the bluff, the bottom line up front. Be direct. Don't be that guy. Okay, so these are the people that you don't want to be. The CC king, don't CC everybody. Not everybody needs to know. Not everybody wants to know. Don't always reply back. Not everyone needs to know what you think. The reply all princess. There's a difference between replying to one person and replying all. People need to figure it out. The CC clown, don't mess that up. I don't CC the wrong people or BC the wrong people. And then the person who talks like they're texting in an email. There are people that do that, and there are people that offends. So Savage says not to be that guy. Here's a couple tips. This is according to Bradford. He said it is not okay to ask about weekend plans. I know where one of my coworkers, I know where one of my friends works. They often on Friday will talk about their weekend plans. So I think that depends on company culture. This particular author says don't send Happy Friday messages. Don't use emoticons. Out of the office use, either avoiding it or using it. I think you've got to, again, follow company policy. It can be helpful to let people know why you're not responding. I think relying on it too heavily can be really frustrating for customers and clients. I would avoid OMGs and other abbreviations that people may not know what they mean. And I would avoid being too friendly or too close, like using honey, dear, and those other terms of endearment. So it's kind of walking a fine line. So hopefully this gave you a little bit more help or information about some email and kind of what's going on. A lot of these dates are 2014, 2017. This presentation was put together fairly early, so this is a pretty up-to-date presentation. But if you see any other articles or anything about email, definitely send them my way. If we were in class together, the second thing we would be doing right now is an email activity. So I'm going to post this. I want you to take a look at it. I want you to evaluate these emails based on what we just talked about and tell me what's wrong with them. So you've got 3 different emails. Based on my tips, how would you alter or change these emails? What's wrong with them? Like, take a look at Robert's quote that he has. He's a finance director. Never lose, his rule number 1, never lose money. Rule number 2, never forget rule number 1. He's a finance director. Is that okay? Look at Betsy. She's a PR intern. Oh, she's got a little kitty. And then up here, hey, I just wanted to say thank you for meeting up with us last Wednesday. I attached the file we talked about. And then look here. Guess what? There's no attachment. My supervisor wanted me to let you know she was glad to meet you. Feel free to call me or email me with any questions. There is always time for you. Bess, Scott. So look at these emails. Figure out what you would do to change. What's an issue with them, if anything. And then I want you to write your own little email using a direct or indirect tone. When you're done, this is the answer. This tells you what's wrong with email number 1, email number 2, and email number 3. And this is how you would approach the writing prompts. So here's some kind of individual work for you on emails if you feel like email is what you want to work on. So hopefully this was informative. Call me, email me, text me. I am here.